It's the age-old question. What drives our behavior? Nature or nurture? Genetics or environment? Some of the oldest explanations of criminal behavior center around abnormal physical traits. Here we'll look at some biological traits. I have other videos focusing on psychological. There'll be links in the descriptions below. You can check those out. Early biological theory centered on an underlying premise of biological determinism, that inherited traits completely determine how a person ultimately behaves. Essentially, criminals are the way they are because they're born that way. They are born criminal. These theories were based largely on genetics, linking genetic abnormalities with criminal behavior. They were some of the first real attempts at using the scientific method to study crime. Unfortunately, these theories weren't very good, and all of them were ultimately falsified, meaning they were not found to be supported when rigorously tested. And today they're largely considered more pseudoscience than science. But they were very early attempts, and there's a lot to learn from what they got right, and even more importantly, what they got wrong. One of the earliest attempts to link biological traits with behavior is known as physiognomy. It originated as far back as the 1600s and continued through the 1800s. Physiognomy linked a person's facial features with their moral character. So essentially it was thought that by examining how a person's face looked, how it was structured, if there was anything abnormal about it, that you could determine what type of person they were and therefore ultimately how they would behave. Another was called Phrenology, which was very popular in the 1800s but continued into the 1900s. Phrenology used the anatomy of a person's head, the size of their skull, skull shape, head bumps, ridges, indentations at the base of the skull. All these things were used as indicators of the anatomy of the brain, what the brain looked like. Different areas of the brain were thought to indicate specific personality traits. So by examining these physical abnormalities in the head, it was thought that aspects of a person's personality could be determined, which could then deduce how they would actually act. One of the most famous proponents of phrenology and biological explanations of crime in general was Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso. He was among the first to use the scientific method to try to explain criminal behavior by creating a theory, testing it, modifying it, and then testing it again. And he's often referred to as the father of criminology for this reason, though his ideas have largely been discredited. In his book Criminal Man, originally published in 1876, Lombroso argued that criminals have distinct physical features, those that he labeled as degenerative. Large jaws and teeth, abnormally sized and shaped heads or noses, long arms, shifty or uneven eyes. All of these types of features were used to indicate that a person was born with criminal traits.
The brain that was stolen from my laboratory was a criminal brain.
They were born biologically inferior and therefore had these identifiable physical abnormalities due to this inferiority. Criminals were deemed what was referred to as an Atavistic anomaly, a biological throwback to primitive stages of evolution, a primitive or more savage breed of man, or criminal man, if you will. Biological theories were based on a scientific paradigm very popular at the time known as positivism, which argued that reality could be determined with absolute certainty through objective collection and analysis of data. Now I go through the positivist approach and how it differs from the classical approach in another video. There's a link on the screen and the description below if you want to check that out. Namely though, these early theories were missing a key element of high quality, well-reasoned theory: logic. Two or more concepts have to be logically interconnected together. Why would the way someone looks have anything to do with how they act? Merely observing something like a body type, or a face structure, or a skin color, or a nationality in some people who have committed crimes or who have been deemed criminal does not mean that all the people who share these same characteristics are also all criminals. However, these claims were given added legitimacy due to an erroneous assumption of objectivity. Hey, it can't be wrong, it's scientific, we're just following the data. But using racial, ethnic, class, or any other types of stereotypes to determine who is and is not a criminal is anything but objective science. Now, as you may have already figured out, there was a heavy racial and ethnic prejudice built into the biological determinism of early biological theories. Blacks in particular were closely associated with this picture of a savage throwback to earlier stages of evolution. And there was also prejudice based on class. There weren't a whole lot of rich folks that were being deemed as criminal. And of course, at the time, race and class were heavily intertwined, even more so than they are now. So despite these early attempts at using the scientific method resulting in some very poor and ultimately very harmful theories, they still laid the foundation for the future scientific study of criminality. And they serve as a crucial reminder of what not to do. That said, even though we no longer take seriously these kind of physical characteristics as a valid predictor of behavior, we do still study how we perceive people based on how they look. And this is something that we certainly continue to use in our minds when we're assessing how someone's personality might be like, how they might act, and yes, whether or not they might be criminal. Ever heard somebody say something like, "He looks like a criminal to me," or "She doesn't look like a criminal"? Variations of these types of phrases are often used to this day, and our perceptions have a major impact on who is deemed criminal and who isn't. So simply put, to answer the question, are people born criminal? The answer is no. It is not inevitable that we can pick up a baby that's born today and say with absolute certainty that he or she will end up being a criminal later in life. And this really was a major downfall of the early biological explanations of crime. This central premise of determinism, that we're all destined from birth to turn out a certain way and nothing can be done to change that. Now, does that mean that biology, that nature, plays no role in how we behave? Of course not. Instead, later, what became known as biosocial theories of crime recognized that biology was one factor among many underlying causes. In other words, while biology may influence eventual criminal behavior, it is not the sole cause of criminal behavior. I have another video exploring these more modern biological theories that you can check out as well. So although these early biological explanations were the primary lens through which crime was viewed from the late 1800s through the early 1900s, they fell out of favor entirely for several decades following World War II. Now, why did biological theories just completely disappear almost entirely from accepted scientific discourse over what causes crime? Well, you can join me in the next video where we'll answer that very question.